we're going to start on part 3. This part is by Eric Hobsbawm, by the way, and we'll continue. How will the manifesto strike the reader who comes to it today for the first time? The new reader can hardly fail to be swept up by the passionate conviction, the concentrated brevity, the intellectual and stylistic force of this astonishing pamphlet. It is written as though in a single creative burst, in lapidary sentences almost naturally transforming themselves into the memorable aphorisms which have become known far beyond the world of political debate. From the opening, a specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism, to the final, the proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Equally uncommon in the 19th century German writing, it is written in short, apodictic paragraphs, mainly of 1 to 5 lines, in only 5 cases, out of more than 200 of 15 or more lines. Whatever else it is, the Communist Manifesto as political rhetoric has an almost biblical force. In short, it is impossible to deny its compelling power as literature. However, what will undoubtedly also strike the contemporary reader is the manifesto's remarkable diagnosis of the revolutionary character and impact of bourgeoisie society. The point is not simply that Marx recognized and proclaimed the extraordinary achievements and dynamism of a society he detested, to the surprise of more than one later defender of capitalism against the Red Menace. It is that the world transformed by capitalism, which he described in 1848 in passages of dark, laconic eloquence, is recognizably the world in which we live 150 years later. Curiously, the politically quite unrealistic optimism of two revolutionaries, 28 and 30 years of age, has proved to be the manifesto's most lasting strength. For though the specter of communism did indeed haunt politicians, and though Europe was living through a major period of economic and social crisis, and was about to erupt in the greatest continent-wide revolution of its history, there was plainly no adequate grounds for the manifesto's belief that the moment for the overthrow of capitalism was approaching. The bourgeoisie revolution in Germany will be but the prelude to an immediately following proletarian revolution. On the contrary, as we now know, capitalism was poised for its first era of triumphant global advance. Two things give the manifesto its force. The first is its vision, even at the outset of a triumphal march of capitalism, that this mode of production was not permanent, stable, the end of history, but a temporary phase in the history of humanity, one due, like its predecessors, to be superseded by another kind of society. Unless the manifesto's phrase has not been much noted, its founders in the common ruin of the contending classes. The second is its recognition of the necessary long-term historical tendencies of capitalist development. The revolutionary potential of the capitalist economy was already evident. Marx and Engels did not claim to be the only ones to recognize it. Since the French Revolution, some of the tendencies they observed were plainly having substantial effect. For instance, the decline of independent or but loosely connected provinces with separate interest laws, governments, and systems of taxation before nation-states, with one government, one code of laws, one national class interest, one frontier, and one customs tariff. Nevertheless, by the late 1840s, what the bourgeoisie had achieved was a great deal more modest than the miracles ascribed to it in the manifesto. After all, in 1850, the world produced no more than 71,000 tons of steel, almost 70% of that in Britain, and had built less than 24,000 miles of railroads, 2/3 of these in Britain and the USA. Historians have had no difficulty in showing that even in Britain, the Industrial Revolution had hardly created an industrial or even a predominantly urban country before the 1850s. Marx and Engels did not describe the world as it had already been transformed by capitalism in 1848. They predicted how it was logically destined to be transformed by it. Now, in the third millennium of the Western calendar, we live in a world in which this transformation has largely taken place. In some ways, we can even see the force of the manifesto's predictions more clearly than the generations between us and its publication. For until the revolution in transport and communication since the Second World War, there were limits to the globalization of production, to giving a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. Until the 1970s, industrialization remained overwhelmingly confined to the regions of origin. Some schools of Marxists could even argue that capitalism, at least in its imperialist form, far from compelling all nations on pain of extinction to adopt the bourgeoisie mode of production, was by its nature perpetuating or even creating underdevelopment in the so-called Third World. While 1/3 of the human race lived in economies of the Soviet communist type, it seemed as though capitalism would never succeed in compelling all nations to become bourgeoisie themselves. It would not create a world after its own image. Again, before the 1960s, the manifesto's announcement that capitalism brought about the destruction of the family seemed not to have been verified, even in the advanced Western countries where today something like half of all children are born to or brought up by single mothers, and half of all households in big cities consist of single persons. In short, what might in 1848 have struck an uncommitted reader as revolutionary rhetoric, or at best as plausible prediction, can now be read as a concise characterization of capitalism at the end of the 20th century. Of what other document of the 1840s can this be said? Part 4. However, if at the end of the millennium we must be struck by the acuteness of the manifesto's vision of the then remote future of a massively globalized capitalism, the failure of another of its forecasts is equally striking. It is now evident that the bourgeoisie has not produced, above all, its own gravediggers in the proletariat. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat have not proved equally inevitable. The contrast between the two halves of the manifesto's analysis in its section on bourgeoisie and proletarians calls for more explanation after 150 years than it did at the time of its centenary. The problem lies not in Marx's and Engels' vision of a capitalism which necessarily transformed most of the people earning their living in this economy into men and women who depend for their livelihood on hiring themselves out for wages or salaries. It has undoubtedly tended to do so, though today the incomes of some who are technically employees hired for a salary, such as corporation executives, can hardly count as proletarian. Nor does it lie essentially in their belief that most of this working population would consist of a workforce of industrial labor. While Great Britain remained quite exceptional as a country in which wage-paid manual workers formed the absolute majority of the population, the development of industrial production required massive and growing inputs of manual labor for well over a century after the manifesto. Unquestionably, this is no longer the case in modern capital-intensive high-tech production, a development not considered in the manifesto. Though, in fact, in his more mature economic studies, Marx himself envisaged the possible development of an increasingly laborless economy, at least in the post-capitalist era. Even in the old industrial economies of capitalism, the percentage of people employed in manufacturing industry remained stable until the 1970s, except for the USA, where the decline set in a little earlier. Indeed, with very few exceptions, such as Britain, Belgium, and the US, in 1970, industrial workers probably formed a larger proportion of the total occupied population in the industrial and industrializing world than ever before. In any case, the overthrow of capitalism envisioned by the manifesto relied not on the prior transformation of the majority of the occupied population into proletarians, but on the assumption that the situation of the proletariat in the capitalist economy was such that once recognized as a necessarily political class movement, it would take the lead and rally round itself the discontent of the other classes, and thus acquire political power as the independent movement of the immense majority in the interests of the immense majority. Thus the proletariat would rise to be the leading class of the nation, constitute itself as the nation. Since capitalism has not been overthrown, we are apt to dismiss this prediction. Yet, utterly improbable though it looked in 1848, the politics of most European capitalist countries were to be transformed by the rise of organized political movements basing themselves on the class-conscious working class, which had barely made its appearance outside of Great Britain. Labor and socialist parties emerged in most parts of the developed world in the 1880s, becoming mass parties in states with the democratic franchise which they did so much to bring about. During and after World War I, as one branch of proletarian parties followed the revolutionary road of the Bolsheviks, another branch became the sustaining pillars of a democratized capitalism. The Bolshevik branch is no longer of much significance in Europe, or parties of this kind have assimilated to social democracy. Social democracy, as understood in the days of Bebel or even Clement Edel, is fighting a rearguard action. Nevertheless, the social democratic parties of the Second International, sometimes under their original names, are still potentially the parties of government in several European states. Though such governments were less common in the early 21st century than they had been in the late 20th, these parties have shown a unique record of continuity as major political agents over more than a century. In short, what is wrong is not the manifesto's prediction of the central role political movements based on the working class, and still sometimes specifically bearing the class name, as in the British, Dutch, Norwegian, and Australasian labor parties, it is the proposition of all the classes that stand face to face with the bourgeoisie today. The proletariat alone is a really revolutionary class, whose inevitable destiny, implicit in the nature and development of capitalism, is to overthrow the bourgeoisie. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. Even in the notoriously hungry 40s, the mechanism which was to ensure this, the inevitable pauperization of the laborers, was not totally convincing, unless on the assumption, implausible even then, that capitalism was in its final crisis and about to be immediately overthrown. It was a double mechanism. In addition to the effect of pauperization on the workers' movement, it proved that the bourgeoisie was unfit to rule because it is incompetent to assure an existence to its slave within his slavery, because it cannot help letting him sink into such a state that it had to feed them instead of being fed by him. Far from providing the profit which fueled the engine of capitalism, labor now drained it away. But given the enormous economic potential of capitalism, so dramatically expanded in the manifesto itself, why was it inevitable that capitalism could not provide a livelihood, however miserable, for most of its working class, or alternatively, that it could not afford a welfare system? That pauperism, in the strict sense, develops even more rapidly than population and wealth. If capitalism had a long life before it, as became obvious very soon after 1848, this did not have to happen, and indeed it did not. The manifesto's vision of this historic development of bourgeoisie society, including the working class which it generated, did not necessarily lead to the conclusion that the proletariat would overthrow capitalism, and in so doing open the way to the development of communism, because vision and conclusion did not derive from the same analysis. The aim of communism, adopted before Marx became Marxist, was derived not from the analysis of the nature and the development of capitalism, but from a philosophical, indeed an eschatological, argument about human nature and destiny. The idea fundamental for Marx from then on, that the proletariat was a class which could not liberate itself without thereby liberating society as a whole, first appears as a philosophical deduction rather than a product of observation. As George Lichtenheim put it, the proletariat makes its first appearance in Marx's writings as the social force needed to realize the aims of German philosophy as Marx saw it in 1843 to 44. The positive possibility of German emancipation, wrote Marx in the introduction of a critique of Hegel's philosophy of law, lay in the formation of a class with radical chains, a class which is the dissolution of all classes, a sphere of society which has a universal character because its sufferings are universal, and which claims no particular right, but the wrong committed against it is not a particular wrong, but wrong as such. This dissolution of society as a particular class is the proletariat. The emancipation of the German is the emancipation of the human being. Philosophy is the head of the emancipation, and the proletariat is at its heart. Philosophy cannot realize itself without abolishing the proletariat, and the proletariat cannot be abolished without philosophy being made a reality. At this time, Marx knew little more about the proletariat than that it is coming into being in Germany only as a result of the rising industrial development, and this was precisely its potential as a liberating force, since, unlike the poor masses of traditional society, it was the child of a drastic dissolution of society, and therefore, by its existence, proclaimed the dissolution of the hitherto existing world order. He knew even less about labor movements, though he knew a great deal about the history of the French Revolution. In Engels, he acquired a partner who brought to the partnership the concept of the Industrial Revolution, an understanding of the dynamics of capitalist economy as it actually existed in Britain, and the rudiments of an economic analysis, all of which led him to predict a future social revolution to be fomented by an actual working class about which, living and working in Britain in the early 1840s, he knew a great deal. Marx and Engels' approaches to the proletariat and communism complemented one another. So did their respective conceptions of the class struggle as a motor of history. In Marx's case, derived largely from the study of the French Revolutionary period, in Engels from the experience of social movements in post-Napoleonic Britain. It is no surprise that they found themselves, in Engels' words, in agreement in all theoretical fields. Engels brought to Marx the elements of a model which demonstrated the fluctuating and self-destabilizing nature of the operations of the capitalist economy, notably the outlines of a theory of economic crisis, and empirical material about the rise of the British working class movement and the revolutionary role it could play in Britain. In the 1840s, the conclusion that society was on the verge of revolution was not implausible, nor was the prediction that the working class, however immature, would lead it. After all, within weeks of the publication of the manifesto, a movement of the Paris workers overthrew the French monarchy and gave the signal for revolution to half of Europe. Nevertheless, the tendency for capitalist development to generate an essentially revolutionary proletariat cannot be deduced from the analysis of the nature of capitalist development. It was one possible consequence of this development, but could not be shown to be the only possible one. Still less could it be shown that a successful overthrow of capitalism by the proletariat must necessarily open the way to communist development. The manifesto claims no more than that it would then initiate a process of very gradual change. Marx's vision of a proletariat whose very essence destined it to emancipate all humanity, and end class society by its overthrow of capitalism, represents a hope read into his analysis of capitalism, but not a conclusion necessarily imposed by that analysis. What the manifesto's analysis of capitalism could undoubtedly lead to, especially when it is extended by Marx's analysis of economic concentration, which is barely hinted at in 1848, is a more general and less specific conclusion about the self-destructive forces built into the capitalist development. It must reach a point, and in 2012, it is not only Marxists who will accept this, where modern bourgeoisie society, with its relations of productions, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld whom he has called up. The conditions of bourgeoisie society are too narrow to encompass the wealth created by them. It is not unreasonable to conclude that the contradictions inherent in a market system based on no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment, a system of exploitation and of endless accumulation, can never be overcome. That at some point in a series of transformations and restructurings, the development of this essentially self-destabilizing system will lead to a state of affairs that can no longer be described as capitalism. Or, to quote the later Marx, when centralization of the means of production and the socialization of labor at last reach a point where they become incompatible with their capitalist integument, and that integument is burst asunder. By what name the subsequent state of affairs is described is immaterial. However, as the effects of the world economic explosion on the world environment demonstrate, it will necessarily have to mark a sharp shift away from private appropriation to social management on a global scale. It is extremely unlikely that such a post-capitalist society would correspond to the traditional models of socialism, and still less to the really existing socialisms of the Soviet era. What forms it might take and how far it would embody the humanist values of Marx and Engels' communism would depend on the political action through which this change came about. For this, as the manifesto holds, is central to the shaping of historical change. Part 5. In the Marxian view, however, we describe that historic moment when the integument is burst asunder. Politics will be an essential element in it. The manifesto has been read primarily as a document of historical inevitability, and indeed its force derived largely from the confidence it gave its readers that capitalism was inevitably destined to be buried by its gravediggers, and that now, and no earlier era in history, the conditions for emancipation had come into being. Yet, contrary to widespread assumptions, inasmuch as it believes that historical change proceeds through men making their own history, it is not a determinist document. It is not a determinist document. The graves have to be dug by or through human action. A determinist reading of this argument is indeed possible. It has been suggested that Engels tended towards it more naturally than Marx, with important consequences for the development of Marxist theory and the Marxist labor movement after Marx's death. However, though Engels' own earlier drafts have been cited as evidence, it cannot in fact be read into the manifesto itself. When it leaves the field of historical analysis and enters the present, it is a document of choices, of political possibilities rather than probabilities, let alone certainties. Between now and the unpredictable time when, in the course of development, there would be an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all, lies the realm of political action. Historical change through social praxis, through collective action, is at its core. The manifesto sees the development of the proletariat as the organization of the proletarians into a class, and consequently into a political party. The conquest of political party by the proletariat, the winning of democracy, is a first step in the workers' revolution, and the future of society hinges on the subsequent political actions of the new regime, how the proletariat will use its political supremacy. The commitment to politics is what historically distinguished Marxian socialism from the anarchist, and the successors of those socialists whose rejection of all political action the manifesto specifically condemns. Even before Lenin, Marxian theory was not just about what history shows us will happen, but also about what must be done. Admittedly, the 20th century Soviet experience has taught us that it might be better not to do what must be done under historical conditions which virtually put success beyond reach, but this lesson might have also been learned from considering the implications of the Communist Manifesto. But then the manifesto, and this is not the least of its remarkable qualities, is a document which envisioned failure. It hoped that the outcome of capitalist development would be a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, but as we have already seen, it did not exclude the alternative, common ruin. Many years later, another Marxian rephrased this as the choice between socialism and barbarity. Which of these will prevail is the question which the 21st century must be left to answer. And so with that quasi-short introduction by Eric Hobsbawm begins the actual manifesto of the Communist Party. So again, this is dated to 1848.